Hi, I'm Kurt Hull. I'm Project Manager of Climate Change Connection, which is a program of the Manitoba Eco Network. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about climate change, Manitoba's emissions, and Manitoba's solutions. First of all, climate change. Climate change is the defining problem of the planet right now. And it's caused primarily by greenhouse gases. And this graph that you're seeing here has the years at the bottom from 1990 to 2013 and the amount of emissions that are generated every year on the vertical axis in kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we're going to see Manitoba's emissions and Manitoba's targets. Because Manitoba set targets a few years ago that was consistent with the Kyoto targets that many countries of the world had adopted. So Manitoba's contribution should have been that we should have annual emissions of under 18,000 kilotons. Then just last year, in 2015, we set new targets for 2030. And that would bring us down to around 14,000 kilotons. But what have we been doing? Manitoba's emissions actually have been well above both of these targets. So we've got work to do. We have to take some action to reduce our emissions. Where do our emissions come from? Well, if we carve them up into a pie, we'll look at Manitoba's emissions pie, which is quite unique for the country because almost every other province and every other country has got a very large portion of the pie comes from the emissions that are required to generate electricity from coal, usually from coal and other fossil fuels. But Manitoba's got a hydro resource that we enjoy here. So our pie doesn't have an electrical component. Instead, we've got transportation is the big one, agriculture, and stationary combustion, which is how we heat our homes and buildings, and then waste and a few others. So the big one is transportation. Where does transportation emissions come from? It comes from how we move ourselves around and how we move goods from place to place within the province. And there's other machines involved in these emissions, but the ones that most of us are concerned about have to do with cars and what we use to move ourselves around. And it's been an interesting pattern that have happened in the last few years with a decline in the number of cars and an increase in the number of SUVs, vans, and half-tons. But in the last few years, even the cars have gone up. The other big contributor, and the next big contributor, is agriculture. And what we're talking about is agriculture primarily for export. We're going to talk about agriculture again in solutions. But the agriculture related to raising of animals and raising of crops. So the emissions from the animals themselves and manure, or from crops and primarily the synthetic fertilizers that are used for fertilizing the soil. And the emissions of those contributors look like this. And there are components to the emissions, some of which come from soils and some of which come from animals. In the bottom three lines that you see on that graph, we've got two of them which come from animals. That's the enteric fermentation and the manure management curves. The one that comes from soils and the synthetic fertilizers we put on soils is the one that's called agricultural soils. And when you put those three components together, it produces the blue line that you see at the top of the graph, which is all agricultural emissions. The third big component is stationary combustion, or heating of buildings. And we use primarily natural gas for heating our buildings. And the data looks like this. We've got a decline in the emissions per year that come from residential heating, from heating our homes. And the emissions from commercial and institutional is not quite the same. It's got a bit of a plateau and then a slight decline. So That's the third big component of emissions. And often people are concerned about waste and think about waste as being a big contributor. We saw that in the pie chart that it was responsible for about 5% of the emissions. And within the waste category, people think that everything we put into the garbage can is contributing to greenhouse gases, but that's not quite the case. In fact, it's only the organic waste that is contributing to greenhouse gases, primarily organic waste. So the apple cores and banana peels that you put into the garbage, as long as they don't go into if you don't put them into your compost and put them into your garbage, it winds up in the landfill and results in methane production. And this is what Manitoba's greenhouse gas emissions from waste look like. So this is from landfills, hitting a plateau in the middle of the last decade, and then a bit of a decline because in 2012 we capped the emissions at the Brady Road landfill. So we see a little bit of a decline after that. So we have to talk about solution now. What are we going to do about this? And Manitoba's contribution to the overall problem of the planet, we can't solve the problem on our own. Instead, we have to do what we can, and one of the most important things we have to do is we have to build our own resilience. What does that mean? Well, the dictionary says that resilience calls it the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. So if you think about that, that's toughness, being able to rely on yourself and being capable of recovering from difficulties. And when people think about the impacts of climate change, they think about floods. Here in Manitoba, we think about floods. And 2011 was a flood year, 2014 another flood year. We can anticipate more floods, and we have to protect ourselves from floods. But to really be resilient, we have to be able to protect ourselves or be able to be resilient with respect to other factors that usually wind up being economic, because there's other risks out there. And even climate change has got an economic impact. So we've got to build our own resilience. And when I think of Manitoba's resilience, what I mean is Manitoba's ability to meet our basic needs ourselves without fossil fuels. So what do I mean by basic needs? Basic needs are our needs for water, food, heat, and transportation. So some ideas for how we could become resilient and able to meet our basic needs in these areas. When it comes to water, first of all, we need to protect the sources of water, protect our drinking water. And that means protecting our aquifers, the underground sources of water, and reservoirs from contamination from these overland floods that are happening more and more frequently. And then we should reduce our usage of water, our need for water, and using alternatives such as rainwater and grey water for other uses instead of using water that's drinking water. The next important basic need that we need to meet has to do with food, and the magic solution here has to do with local production of food. We need to focus more on producing the food that we need, that we're going to put on the table, as opposed to the food that we export to elsewhere. We have to produce, process, store, and distribute the food that we eat locally. The heat for our buildings, we need to, first of all, reduce the need for heating. We have to concentrate on the way our buildings are built, how they're insulated, how they're sealed. And there's a really important concept called passive house that I think we should be really serious about pursuing. Passive house is an approach to construction of buildings that focuses on the insulation and the seal of the building in such a way that the energy required to heat and cool it is dramatically reduced, to the point where a passive house building requires about 20% of the energy for heating and cooling that a building made with standard construction might require. And then what energy sources do we use to heat our buildings as opposed to natural gas? Well, there's biomass, meaning wood waste, and agricultural waste, straw, that can be used for heating in some cases. Geothermal, or ground source heat pumps, getting heat from the ground. And both of those, geothermal and biomass, are already being applied in various parts of the province, including in First Nations communities, remote communities. There's real good opportunities, I think, there for replacing heating with biomass and geothermal in communities like that. And solar, meaning I'm not talking about photovoltaic solar here, producing electricity. Here I'm talking about solar, passive solar used for heating. Things like solar walls or solar hot water heating. And then how we distribute the heat around between buildings. Rather than concentrating, having heating in every single building, there's a concept called district heating, where you have a central heat plant and then you distribute the heat amongst a collection of buildings. I think there's real possibility for that as well. And then transportation. We saw on the pie chart that transportation was the biggest part of the pie. And so we need to focus on it. We need to focus on, first of all, reducing our need to transport. Why do we have to move people around so much? Why do we have to move goods around? So we have to think about that. And one of the strategies to reduce that would be to produce more things locally and to work closer to home, those kinds of things. And another way to reduce the need is to reduce the requirement to travel at all with things like virtual meetings through Skype and other electronic means like that. And then when we do move around, alternative sources of fuel, electrification of the transportation fleet, and alternative modes rather than individual single passenger cars, public transportation, active transportation, walking, those kinds of things, bicycles, are all really important parts of the transportation piece. Now, people always ask, what can I do? And we all need to work on this. I said that it was a global problem and Manitoba can't solve it on its own, but we have to be part of the solution. We have to do our part. And that means taking a look at what we do as individuals in those big contributors of greenhouse gases that I pointed out in the pie chart. So how we move ourselves around. How much fuel do you burn in a year? And what we eat. There's a contribution that can be made by reducing the amount of meat that we eat. I'm not talking about going vegetarian necessarily, but go back to 4 days a week or cut down by one day a week at the start of meat that you eat, because meat has a big requirement for water, and the animals themselves are the source of a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. And then heating our homes. So making sure your homes are insulated and well sealed, that you've got vapor barrier that's intact, and you've got storm doors. There's all kinds of things that we can do to make our homes more efficient. But really the big one, the thing that we have to think about a lot, has to do with how we spend our money. Whether or not we are buying things because we need them, or whether we're buying them just because we want them. Because if these things come from far away, there's transportation emissions. And if it's something that we don't really use and we wind up throwing it away, then all of those greenhouse gases have been emitted for nothing, for waste. So really, the biggest thing that we can do, though, is we can support policies when we see them, when they are introduced, when they're proposed. We as citizens can support them because they are necessary for the solution. And we have to get behind them. Because in the end, it's up to us. It's up to us as individuals, because this is an important problem, and I believe that it can be solved. I believe that it has to be solved, but I also am optimistic that it can be solved. In 2015, there was COP21. The world came up with an agreement that said, yes, we all have to do something here. So virtually all of the countries of the world are now behind this. So the countries of the world are behind it. We as individuals have to get behind it, and Manitoba has to take action, and we can succeed because we have to.